Hi, I'm Charlie Dugan. I'm a history teacher at Sapulpa High School. I teach AP European History and AP World History. Have been here about 40 years. This is 41 now, and I'm really interested in all aspects of history, especially the connections between historical events and how that kind of spider web of history has one thing connected to another. Sometimes things that we really don't expect. And so I was going to talk about three of those connections today that go together in kind of an unusual way, sometimes unexpected. And it starts off with a guy by the name of Alexander the Great. Usually people that we call the Great are people that have created empires, which means they've killed a lot of people to make an empire. But this particular guy was born in 356 BC, and he was born in Macedonia, which is just north of Greece. In Macedonia, his father Philip was the ruler, and Philip had conquered Greece and had brought Aristotle, famous Greek philosopher, up to be a tutor for his son Alexander. Now, Aristotle tutored Alexander until Alexander was 16 years old. And so he had a lot of background in Greek science, Greek philosophy, Greek math, all these things of Greek culture. Well, when Alexander was 20 years old, his father Philip was assassinated by one of his own personal guards. And so at the age of 20, Alexander becomes the king of Macedonia and of Greece, because Greece had been conquered by his dad. Well, at that time, what happened was Alexander decided to carry out his dad's wishes to go on and try to expand the empire. So Alexander takes his army, along with a Greek army, and mostly commanded by Greek generals, and they begin the conquest of first Turkey. They conquer up to the Danube in Europe. They conquer the west coast of the Middle East. They conquer into Egypt, conquer across the Mesopotamia. Then they conquer the Persian Empire. Over a period of 10 years, Alexander and his armies conquer all the way over to northern India. And so after 10 years of conquest and assembling this huge Alexander empire, at this time, his soldiers finally got tired of conquering, and they wanted to stop. And so Alexander sort of retires from conquering, goes back to Babylon, where he dies at the age of 32 of a fever. And so his empire is split up between his 10 generals. But here's the impact of what happened with Alexander. Because Alexander had spent all this time conquering this territory, he has spread all this Greek culture throughout all this area that was in which a lot of Greek culture was unknown. He spread it into Egypt, across Persia, into the Arabic world, where these things would be preserved for years and years. He brought in architecture, Greek-style architecture. In fact, Alexander built 11 different cities, all of which were named Alexandria. The biggest of those cities was in northern Egypt, and the Alexandria in northern Egypt became a center of education, where a lot of Greek philosophers and mathematicians would travel to it over the next coming centuries. And it was considered to be a place where all the knowledge of the known world had been accumulated. And so Alexander, even though his time was short, he had spread Greek culture across everything. Now, here's the impact of that. Once he spread this, it was preserved by them at times where Greek culture was dying elsewhere. After the Roman occupation of Greece, later on, a couple of centuries later, and finally the Christianization of the Roman Empire, and when Rome fell apart and we entered the Middle Ages, basically the Roman Catholic Church at that time began to eliminate anything of these Greco cultures that was pre-Christian. And so a lot of the Greek philosophy, Greek science and things like that kind of became lost to the European world. Now, meanwhile, it was being preserved in the Arabic world and in the Persian world. And so it had been saved there while Europe kind of got away from it and basically, during the Middle Ages, based everything on the Christian Bible. Now, so a couple of things happened with this too that went on with Alexander. Not only did he preserve all this Greco-Roman stuff inside the Persian Arabic world, but and brought the architecture there, but when his generals split up his empire, he had a Greek general that took over Egypt and became the next pharaoh of Egypt, a guy by the name of Ptolemy. And later on, his descendants, because of Alexander's conquest, his descendants would be the final rulers of Egypt. And in fact, the very last one that most people know of was Cleopatra VII, who was the one who became associated with Julius Caesar and was the last queen of Egypt. But she was there because of her Greek family was there because of Alexander's conquest. Now, another thing that happened too, because Alexander spread all this Greek knowledge and science and philosophy across the Arabic world, was that Greek became the language of the educated people. And so everyone learned Greek. And that's why one of the reasons in the first century AD in the Middle East, when people like Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, Paul, Timothy, and all these guys began to write what we now call the New Testament, it was written in Greek because that had been spread across that part of the world by Alexander some 300 years before that. So Alexander has a big impact on a lot of things, even though he had a short-lived empire, 10 years, and because he spread all these things across the empire that he conquered. Okay, now, these things that he spread and preserved Greek empire actually will have an impact on the Renaissance later on because of a few other events that happen that seem like they're not connected to Alexander, but they have a connection. One of those things is the Crusades. In 1095 AD, Pope Urban of the Italian Pope received a letter from Alexis, the king of Constantinople. He was having trouble with the Turks, and he wanted Urban to send some help so he could fight against the Turks. Well, Urban saw this as a good opportunity, not just to go help Alexis, but it was a good opportunity for them to go down and take away the Holy Lands, which since the 700s had been occupied by the Muslims. It was one of the greatest propaganda jobs in history. Pope Urban II sold Europeans that idea that the Muslims were mistreating Christians and mistreating Jews, and it was a terrible situation there. While meanwhile, in Jerusalem was a city of three cultures. They had Jews that lived there, Christians that lived there, and Muslims that all lived there together. And Christians were able to visit the sacred sites, but Urban made a great propaganda job that convinced Europeans that they had to go save Christianity by taking the Holy Lands away from the Muslims. So for 200 years, Christian armies traveled down to the Middle East to fight against the Muslims. The only time they're really successful is in the first 75 years, where they make a trip down and they actually occupy Jerusalem and take it over, even though it's short-lived, because they will soon lose it back to a guy by the name of Saladin, who's an Egyptian Muslim. But it's not really, they call it the Holy Crusades, but it's not really very holy. In fact, it involved ransacking cities on their way to the Holy Lands in order to get supplies, murder, cannibalism, all sorts of things that seem very unholy as a part of this thing. In fact, when they took Jerusalem, the Crusaders went in and they locked all of the Jews in the synagogue and set the synagogue on fire. So the Crusades are really a lot different than what people think of. But here's the lasting result of the Crusades. When Crusaders went to the Middle East, they came into contact with the culture that had been left behind by Alexander. And so when Crusaders went back to Europe, they took back with them the Greek humanism, the Greek philosophy, the Greek math, the Greek science, all these things that they'd come back into contact with. They took these texts and things back to the European world. Because of the reintroduction of these things into the European world, that's what brought on the Renaissance. And of course, the trade that developed there, because while Venetian traders were taking Crusaders to the Holy Lands to fight against Muslims, they were also trading with the Muslims and bringing back silks and spices that the Muslims had gotten from China and Indonesia, and it created a demand for those things in Europe. And so these trade routes, they built up cities, which we call urban areas based on Pope Urban, and they also brought in a lot of money to Europe, which stimulated the patrons that paid for the art of Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. And so the Crusades have a direct result on causing the Renaissance, but only because of the Greek culture that had been left there by the conquest of Alexander. Okay, so one more thing connected to this. Christopher Columbus, a name some people love and some people hate, and deservedly so. But why does Columbus sail is the question. Columbus sails, not a lot of people like to portray it as this brave journey of discovery. But actually, all these guys that sailed, they sailed because they were paid for, because in Europe they had demand now. They wanted to get these silks and spices and things from Asia. They were buying them from the Muslims and the Arabs in the Middle East, but they wanted to cut out the middleman. Now, another thing that they had discovered during the Crusades was that these Arabs had been sailing across the Indian Ocean for a long time, and they had developed a technology that Europeans didn't have, things like the sextant that were used to navigate with. And so as those things came back to Europe, brought in by the Crusaders, it allowed these sailors in Europe to develop a technology that would let them sail further than they'd sailed before. And so the first Europeans trying to cut out the middleman to deal directly with the Asians and buy their silks and spices were the Portuguese, who tried to sail around Africa. And of course, Bartholomew Diaz and Vasco da Gama eventually sail around Africa and make their way to Asia. Christopher Columbus decides to try a different way, and he decides to sail west. You know, everyone had known the world was round since about 500s BC. People that think about that they thought there was flat Earth, that's an error, because of Greek science, a guy by the name of Eratosthenes and a guy by the name of Ptolemy, they had already figured out the circumference of the Earth mathematically, and by seeing the round Earth as a shadow on the moon during the eclipse. So everyone knew that the Earth was a sphere. Now, Columbus chose some of this astronomy that had been left behind by Ptolemy to decide whether or not he could make a trip from Europe to Asia and be able to make that distance. Well, Ptolemy had chosen a size of the world that was about 18,000 miles around. Eratosthenes had a world that was bigger than 25,000 miles around, which was closer to correct. Columbus chose the small world. Like I said, this was science that had been preserved in the Arabic world and brought back to Europe. And so when Columbus chose that, he sold them on the idea that he would be able to make that trip and would be able to reach Asia. And of course, we know that he stumbled into America and didn't know where he was for a long time, and renamed Americans Indians because he thought it was in Indonesia, and all sorts of mistakes that came along with Columbus. But Columbus never would have sailed had it not been the demand that had been created in the Crusades for the silks and spices there, and he wouldn't have had the technology and the knowledge of the world had it not been for the Greco-Roman science and philosophy that had been left there by Alexander the Great. And all those things basically come back to Alexander's 10-year conquest and an importance that he left behind in history that he wouldn't have realized and no one would have realized until all these things came to fruition. And so history has all these great connections between things that we may not think of, like the development of a stirrup and saving Europe from the Muslim invasion because these guys had stirrups. Little things like that make history really interesting and have all these connections that we're not aware of just on the surface of when we look at Alexander by himself or look at Columbus by himself or look at the Crusades by themselves. You know, great little things that I hope that will make you be interested in history too.